Hey everybody, welcome to She Shed Comedy Podcast. I'm your host, Linda Schwartz, and today I have a very special person with me. Her name is Grace Klein. She's a stand-up comedian here in San Diego. Grace, thank you so much for coming on such kind of short notice.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, and I really, so the intention of this show, if you don't know, is to really empower women who are pursuing a career in comedy. And just by sharing stories and wisdom of your own experience. And I would love to know what your experience has been, what your journey's been like, why you got into stand-up comedy, all of the good stuff, you know?
For sure.
Like, when did you know that stand-up comedy was your calling?
Oh my gosh. I don't know if there was ever a particular moment where I knew specifically stand-up comedy. I know that from a really early age, if I was funny, I got attention. I'm the youngest of 4 kids, which isn't that many kids. A lot of people have way more siblings. So I hear stories of the comments like, oh, I had like 8 siblings. I'm like, okay, I wasn't quite in that same situation. But I was the youngest, and my mom's side of the family is huge, so there were tons of aunts and uncles, and they were loud. Everyone was loud. They talked a lot, and I knew, and I remember there were 2 specific moments where I made some comment or I made some joke, and everyone laughed. And I was like, oh, okay, this is how people notice me. So that was just kind of always in me from an early age. So I was always trying to be funny. I was always trying to be not necessarily be the center of attention, but just, get attention. And I knew that humor did that. So that was just kind of in me until I became an adult. And I never really thought about doing comedy until one of my friends, she did improv comedy. And I had loved watching Saturday Night Live. And there was a period in high school where I recorded every Saturday Night Live. Like, I had just tapes and tapes and tapes, VHS tapes, if there's any younger people watching this. I had all these VHS tapes that I'd record Saturday Night Live. And so I thought for a while there, I was like, oh, someday I'm going to be on Saturday Night Live. But I had no idea, I had no frame of reference of how anyone would even do that. And then a friend invited me to come do some improv classes with her. I was like, oh, sure, yeah, I'll do that. So that was kind of my introduction to doing any kind of comedy whatsoever. And so I did some drop-in classes.
How long ago was that?
Oh gosh, that was 2012.
Cool.
Or 11. Somewhere in there. Yeah.
So you started improv classes, and then what?
So I did the improv classes kind of off and on, and then I decided to do, so the thing was, I'd been writing down jokes for years, or stuff that I thought, this is ridiculous, this doesn't make sense, or this is funny, but I had no, avenue for it. So I took a sketch writing class with a group called Second City, and they're out of Chicago, Detroit, a lot of major cities, LA. So I took a sketch writing class. I thought, well, maybe this will help me incorporate all this stuff that I've been writing. And so I did that for a while, and it did to an extent, but then it kind of came down to, this is all stand-up material. That's really the only way to deliver these jokes.
Yeah.
Granted, not all of them were good jokes, but there was just no other way to do it. And so I started thinking maybe I should try stand-up comedy, but it just seemed so scary at the time to do that. But yeah, that was when I kind of decided maybe stand-up was the route to go. And so it took me about a year before I actually found an open mic and did it.
Well, listen, I totally get that, because I'm in classes right now, and I've always had this affinity for stand-up comedy, and I remember in my early 20s, I would watch Def Comedy Jams. I would have I had 3 or 4 DVDs that I just played over and over and over.
Yeah.
And back then it was this just a source of relief for me. I never imagined that I could ever do stand up for a career or a living or anything. And then 6 years ago, I got on stage for the first time, and it was like the most exhilarating thing I'd ever done.
Yeah.
And it was like to a crowd of almost 300 people, and I was like, oh my god! But that was like a total fluke, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
And so, but life got in the way, and here I am, like I'm really starting from scratch
Mm-hmm.
and getting back into it, and it's scary.
Yeah.
The thought of going to an open mic, like, is so frightening to me right
Yeah.
now that I feel like even in class, I'm taking Tony Calabrese's class,
Mm-hmm.
and at the end of it, you get to perform.
Uh-huh.
And we had our first class on Sunday, and we have to get up and go, introduce ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
And of course, he like picked me to go first, and I was like, no, I don't
Yeah.
want to do it. No.
Right.
And it's really interesting for me that like for our chosen medium, going up there by yourself
Mm-hmm.
is probably one of the most vulnerable things that anyone can do. And
Mm-hmm.
then on top of that, trying to make people laugh.
Make people
Like,
laugh.
what
I
was
know.
it like at your first open mic?
Oh my gosh. So my first open mic, I did it at, so I lived in Denver at the time. Um, and I wanted to do it outside of Denver. For some reason in my head that made it seem less scary. So I was like, then there's no chance anybody will see me. Like I won't run into any other comedians in the Denver area. So I did have a couple friends that came with me, and we went down to Colorado Springs, and we just looked up an open mic and we went. Well, it was at a 420 speakeasy, and I didn't know what that was. And it's it's just a weed bar. It's
Yeah.
basically like any other bar, except you go up and you order weed, and then you go to your table and you
Oh,
smoke
wow.
it. So we walked in, we're like, is this what we think it is? And they asked me when I was walking in, they're like, are you in the club? It's like, no,
Once I get
what?
in there, I will
I don't
be.
know. Like I had no idea what was going on. So we went into this speakeasy, and I did my 3 minutes or whatever they gave me, and a few people laughed. Like I didn't completely bomb. It wasn't great, but I didn't completely bomb. But then we're like, well, is it better if they're high, or did that make them laugh easier, or would it have been better if they weren't high? So I didn't really know. But the feeling that I had when I got off stage, and
Oh.
because anybody laughed, I was over the moon.
Oh,
Now,
yeah.
if I had that same set, I'd be like, oh, that was terrible. It was terrible. I bombed. But at the time, I didn't have any frame of reference.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
because a couple people laughed, I was like, oh, this is the greatest feeling in the world. Like
Yeah.
it was like running on adrenaline. for the
Yeah, I
next
feel
couple
like,
days.
I think that's why most comedians do that, is like just the feeling after you
Mhm.
get off the stage. And I had JJ Barrows on here
Mhm.
a few weeks ago, and she said something just so profound to me. And one of the things that she said was, if it makes you feel alive, just do it. And I think
Yeah.
that's what performing does for a lot of people, is to
Mhm.
make them feel alive. Because I feel like when you're in the hodrum of life, and
Mhm.
you get into these comfort zones, you forget how to live.
Yeah.
And performing, whether that's stand up or any other medium, sketch comedy, or improv, allows you to like just really get into the present moment and
Mhm.
come alive,
Yeah.
so to speak. That feeling in my heart when I think about going to an open mic, like I'm really looking forward to it, but it's terrifying.
Yeah. Yeah.
So yeah, like what else would you like to share with us in terms of what your journey's been like?
Yeah, so I lived in Seattle for most of my 20s, and then I left there and kind of moved around a little bit. And so I started doing stand up after I left Seattle. So I would have friends that would ask me, how did you get into stand up? And like I'd been funny, I've always been like a funnier person or within my friends, but a lot of people are funny people, and that doesn't necessarily translate
Sure,
into
yeah.
being a stand up comedian. Um, and so they'd ask me, like, how'd you get into it? And I think my last probably year, maybe year and a half to 2 years in Seattle, it was just a really heavy time. There was a lot of things going on for me personally with my friends, and it just felt heavy. And so conversations that I had with people were, how are you doing? And it was just a lot. It was kind of I don't want to say it was a dark time. It wasn't, it's not like anything traumatic happened. It was just a lot going on. And so I think when I left, there was just this sense of like, I need to be free of some of this. I've got to find a way to move past some of these things that happened, and for me, laughter was always my go-to for
Yeah,
stuff like
yeah.
that. And so I just felt like I've got to find a way to be okay. And comedy really was kind of my way of doing that, I think, in some ways, and
Yeah.
translating some of the, my own personality and also my own experiences and making something positive out of it. And then realizing that I actually maybe had a knack for it and being like, oh no, you actually might be able to do this. Like
Yeah.
this isn't just, oh, your friends think you're funny. It's like, no, you can actually get on stage and do it and make something out of, like, create something.
Totally.
Um, yeah.
Yeah, I love that. And I think for a lot of people comedy is a sense of relief
Mm-hmm.
and a way to metabolize those darker feelings or deep feelings of
Mm-hmm.
whatever it is. I mean, I know, like I said, in my 20s, I watched a lot of Def Comedy Jams,
Mm-hmm.
and it was because I was constantly in this feeling of I don't know. I had a lot of stuff going on in my life too,
Mm-hmm.
and it was an escape for me.
Mm-hmm.
And I didn't, back then I didn't realize that I could parlay it into a career, it was
Mm-hmm.
just a way for me to have a sense of relief. And then, I mean, I make my husband laugh all the time, but that's,
Right.
I feel like he just laughs at me
Right.
because
Right.
he loves me, but also, I mean, after that show that I did, I just loved getting into the work of it.
Mm-hmm.
That's what kind of drives me. I love working on things
Yeah.
and metabolizing things and
Mm-hmm.
recognizing um, that this is a way to transform and transmute feelings that I have inside and just switch the lens in a
Mm-hmm.
way to see it in a funny way rather than this self-defeating and self-diminishing way that
Yeah,
we usually,
absolutely.
especially as women, we tend to do that. We let that voice in our head dictate how we feel about certain things, but
Mm-hmm.
comedy allows you to like really put the filter on and see it from a completely different perspective.
Mm-hmm.
How's that helped you in your own life?
Yeah, I completely agree. I think that there's, I mean, we all cope with life in different ways. And I mean, comedy is certainly no substitute for therapy. and there's, and so there's definitely, like, whatever it might be that we have to work through, in our own ways. And maybe
Yeah.
that is therapy, or, whatever it might be. But the thing about comedy that's so interesting is it does, like you said, like, you have to almost, like, take your experience and put it on paper and look at it, which means you actually have to face, like, who you are and what you've been through,
Yeah.
and you have to almost physically face it and look at it. And then, instead of, necessarily, trying to figure out, well, how do I fix it, or how do I make it better, um how do I just reposition it, like you said, like a different look at it in a different lens, and how do I make it funny, and um it just changes that perspective. Things that maybe were heartbreaking now become ironic or funny, and you're like, you
Yeah.
know what, that was ridiculous. Why did that happen? And
It
if
yeah.
I spin this the right way, it really is funny. And so it does help to, I don't know, maybe soften kind of the blows of life, or it doesn't
Yeah.
fix everything, but it is definitely a way of coping with it. And I think that a lot of people turn to, anger, or, Twitter, whatever, is a way of getting their feelings out there, because that's what we're all doing. We're just trying to figure out who we are and why we've been through what we have, and comedy is just another, I think, avenue for doing that.
Totally.
So,
And I feel like it's also, I mean, a way to really heal those things.
mhm,
Just I think that's what healing really is just having a different perspective
mhm,
on the things that you're going through and dealing with. And you're absolutely right. Like, I loved what you said when you put it on paper, it really forces you to confront the things that are coming up for you.
mhm,
And I think that um, we have a hard time doing that.
mhm,
And comedy, personally, I think any kind of performing, and I've said this before, it's like performing and doing stand up or improv or any other work of art is really allowing yourself the grace to confront things in a new way.
Mm-hmm.
And inside of that, it's like a living personal development course.
Yeah.
Right. You really get to see what you're made of, and you also get to see that you can create something out of nothing or something out of your own experiences.
Mm-hmm.
And there's room for us.
Yeah.
There's room for our stories.
Yeah.
And I love that.
Well, the thing too is, when you're doing comedy or performance, you're bringing other people into it,
That,
and you're
yeah.
saying like, hey, this is what happened to me. And all of a sudden people are going, me too. And someone's saying, me too, and you start realizing, oh, like I'm not alone in these experiences. And maybe I was able to make mine funny, or whatever, but people relate. They get it because, when you get up there and you talk about this hard thing happened to me, they're like, oh yeah, I got dumped too by the, whatever, in the same place by the same person 3 times. I kept going back, or what, whatever. You tell this story that you think nobody's gonna understand this. This is this horrible thing, this painful thing that happened to me. And then all of a sudden you bring it to light, and then someone else is like, oh my gosh, me too. And then you both laugh about it. And I think that people often think that laughter can be irreverent. And I'm like, it's an emotion. Like, it's the response to an emotion, but it's a good response. And so I don't see how that's any, different than crying or whatever it is. You're invoking some sort of emotional response, in a healthy way, and it's coming out in a healthy way. And so if people relate to what you're saying, it's good for you, because you're like, oh yeah, I'm not alone. Like, I'm not the only person that has known someone that died from cancer, or has had something traumatic happen. So not only am I not alone in this, somebody else is able to laugh with me in it, or just laugh in general. Like, maybe it's not even about that topic, but just what laughter can do is, I think it's more healing than, well, for me, it's more healing than crying, but I can't say that for a lot of people, but I would much prefer to sit through an hour of laughing than to like cry it out with somebody.
Yeah.
So
I'm in the same boat.
Mm-hmm.
I'm totally in the same boat. So I would love to know what your writing process is like. How do you get through? So if you have an experience in your life that you want to share, how do you get through that process and turn it into a joke?
Mm-hmm. Oh man, a lot of the jokes that I've come up with, or that I actually have done on stage, or maybe I'm working on doing on stage, it's usually been in like stuff that's come up in conversations, or maybe ideas that I had. And gosh, the process of writing, I feel like it's different for every joke. There's some things that I've been able to write out kind of quickly, and then I did it on stage and it worked, and so I kept it, maybe tweaked it a little bit. And then there's other stuff that I'm like, I know that there's something funny here, and I can't quite figure out how to say it in the right way. And so some of those, it's just I've had to do it over and over different ways, or sometimes I've pulled it out of my act and then I've put it back in later and tried it a different way. But yeah, I feel like it's kind of been different for every maybe season even.
Yeah.
And currently I actually have some friends that I'm writing with, and so they don't live in San Diego, and so we Skype. So we'll be like, okay, this is the idea that I have, or maybe this is the bit that I'm working on, and this is where I'm stuck, or this is where I'm trying to, whatever, come up with a good punchline. And then they have suggestions. They'll be like, oh, what if you try it this way or try it that way? And then I've taken a couple writing classes as well. And I'm currently doing one. There's a guy out in Nashville named Rick Roberts, and he does, it's called School of Laughs. He does it in Nashville in person, but then he also does an online version. And that's super helpful because it just gives you prompts. Like, he'll be like, okay, write 10 things about this, or 10 things about this, or whatever. And then, tweak them, and maybe you'll get one good joke out of it, which if you can get one good joke out of writing 20 down, that's a pretty good percentage. So,
and well, it sounds like you have been, devoting a lot of, time to, like really learning the craft too.
Mm-hmm.
So, what are your thoughts on, taking classes? And for somebody who's just starting out, what's your recommendation for doing that?
Yeah, I think that if you, I think most people that want to do comedy, they probably already have some sort of knack for being funny. I would guess.
Yeah.
And so I would say, starting out, kind of, yeah, finding someone that you trust, that you know they know what they're doing. You know, like Tony, for example, he does his classes and he's great. So you know you can trust, what he's telling you because he has success in that field. Um, and so I would say kind of learning. Um, I mean, there's like the basics, the structure of a joke and the setup and the punch and the tag and all of that. And that's it's helpful to learn those things, but I think it's really helpful just to have somebody give you feedback because I think most ideas that comics have, they immediately think they're funny. Like a comedian will be like, "Oh, I'm gonna do this joke. This is gonna be hilarious," and then they do it on stage. No one laughs. And they're like, "Oh." So like we all think when we're starting, we all think, "Oh, this
it's
this
so
is
funny.
gold." Like I have a whole notebook and it's comedy gold, and and that's what like open mics are for. Is well, you figure out pretty quickly that a lot of it's not comedy gold, but it's not even bronze. It's just not good.
It sounds so good in our heads,
Yeah,
doesn't it?
yeah. It's like, oh, this is hilarious.
Yeah.
And people are like, I don't get it. And you're like, oh, well, it's funny to me. My friend laughed, so I had to count. But so getting feedback on it, I think, is super helpful, and being open to feedback, I think, is another thing. A lot of comedians, and myself included, it's hard to hear somebody say that wasn't good, like it wasn't funny. So being open to feedback, and I think if you're in a class, you're immediately setting yourself up to be open to that feedback because that's what you're doing. You're learning. So there's like the mechanics of a joke and how you write jokes, but it's also just, having people give you different ideas of like, maybe if you tried it this way, and then you kind of start to see like, oh, okay. Like your brain just starts to look at things differently. I think the more that you write and the more that either other people give you feedback or the crowd gives you feedback or whatever it might be, you start to maybe write from a slightly different perspective because it trains your brain, I think, to see things a little bit differently. So if anyone's starting out, I would say for sure go
get into a class.
Yeah, get into a class, figure out kind of what this is all about and then go get on stage, which is so intimidating. But the thing too is like I've seen so many comedians bombed, and I've bombed so many times, and nobody walks out of there thinking that you're a terrible part. Like nobody's
it's just part of the process.
Remember, and so I think that feeling of like, oh, this is so overwhelming, and I just stood in front of all these people, nobody laughed. It feels like too much to handle. You're like, I can't do it. Yeah. Be like, but you know what? They're not gonna remember. They're gonna be fine. It's really for you. Like you do it for you when you are first starting out because you have to, and you can't really do it anywhere else. You have to do it on stage. You can't again, I might tell a whole bit and my friends might laugh, but I may not be able to use that ever on stage. Like that's the only way to figure out is if it works is to go do it, which is scary.
But scary. I know that's my biggest hang up right now, and and that's the reason why I'm in this class, and I've been prolonging getting on stage. Like even getting into this class, it's like a 6-week class. I'm like, oh yeah, it's gonna be like 6 more weeks before I before I actually get to do it, and I don't, I know why that is, but I also feel like I just have to get through that. I have to get out of my own way, and for me it's the act of being prepared, and this class is really helping me prepare. And I know at some point no amount of preparation is gonna really help you until you actually get on the stage and do it. And I keep telling myself this, and I'm sure I'll get to that point soon, but I really want to talk about this idea of collaboration in your writing because to me, where I'm at right now, writing is such a solo, like singular kind of experience, and so to bring somebody else into that, what does that actually do for you?
I think for one thing, there's just immediately a sense of camaraderie, which is super important in comedy because comedy, it can be a very lonely endeavor, because regardless of what other comedians are doing, your experience on stage it's yours. Like it's not shared. It's not like on improv or in a play or something where there's multiple people and you're kind of giving feedback on how we all did. what you do on stage is yours alone.
Yeah.
And so
Oh,
the heaviness of that too, it can be overwhelming. So there is a sense of camaraderie. And I think too, like, I have, several friends that are comics, and they just get it in a different way. And even friends, if I ever get down on myself, or I, feel like, man, I should quit comedy, this is not going well, I really have to talk that out with another comedian.
yeah.
Because if I talk it out with my friends that are outside comedy, they just don't understand in the same way. So having people that you trust that are within comedy, I think, is super important, because there is that camaraderie.
Of course.
And then there's that encouragement too, to be like, oh, that's funny. Like, you need to do that bit. You need to figure out a way to do that bit.
Yeah.
And so when you hear that from other comedians too, you're kind of like, okay, so even if I go on stage and this bombs, I still know it's funny. It just means I have to maybe go back and rewrite it. So that camaraderie with them is huge. And then, like you said, like I said, just feedback, just having people say, try it this way, or maybe, do this joke. Like I was, working on, so I have a couple bits where I talk about how, like, I'm single and all my friends are married, and what that, is like in your 30s. And so I'm trying to expand that bit more. And so I was talking with these girls about it, and I said, yeah, like, I'm just trying to come up with just funny things that, because every single person has the experience of what married people say to them, or what older people say to them, or so that everybody gets that. And even if they're married now, they can remember when they were single, stuff that people said to them that was inappropriate or was not helpful. And so we were talking about that. And so I was just like, I'm just trying to make like a list of, like, stuff that they say. And then one of the girls said, she's like, well, what about all of the things that married people say to you in support of being single? Like, here's all the things that you can do that I can't do now that I'm married.
Yeah.
So even just that, I hadn't even thought about going down that road. I was just thinking about stuff that they say, like, well, someday it'll happen for you, or your time's around the corner, or whatever. And so I was thinking it from that person. So even just her giving a slightly different perspective opened up a whole new world. Because then immediately I was like, oh, yeah.
Yeah.
There are a lot of things that people have said, like, oh, but since you're single, you can do this. And I can't do that because I have kids and a husband or whatever. And, so even just having somebody, just an objective person, just even throwing a little suggestion in there can sometimes open up. So that's been the complete road that I've taken with writing that whole bit.
Yeah.
It's from a perspective that I hadn't initially had going into it.
Yeah. So I feel like, I think what I hear you saying is that other people, when you're in a collaboration, whether that's writing or performing or anything, they just offer a different perspective and offer a different frame of reference that we might not have thought about.
Yeah, for
sure. That's really great.
And even, sometimes saying, like, if I say a joke and I'm like, hey, this is a bit that I'm working on, they might be like, yeah, I feel like that's, like, maybe we've heard that before, or that's not as original, or we've heard some version of that bit, and so it's the same thing. You might think this is really funny, and they might be like, yeah, but it's kind of old, know, or maybe it's hacky, or it's not, so it can go both ways. It can offer great new perspective, and it can also be a place where people, like, again, it gives you some of that hard feedback that you need, where you're like, that's just not that good. Or be careful with this particular aspect of your joke. It could be taken this way. Which, I mean, I think it kind of depends on what kind of comic you want to be. And some comics are like, I don't care. Like, they're not worried about offending. And I don't think comics should be worried about offending, but I think that there are some lines still within comedy that you have to be careful. And so you don't want to, it's just good to have feedback, I think, even before you take it to the stage. If you're taking it to the stage with a show. If you're at an open mic, I feel like, say whatever you want, man. Anything goes. Anything goes at an open mic. But if you're doing, like, new material in a show, like, you really want to, especially depending on the audience, like, knowing what kind of audience this is, and so you have to be aware of that too.
Yeah, and I'm really curious to know too, like, how I mean, I'm for me, because I'm in such the beginning process, there's almost a part of me that's married to my material. You know what I mean? And and I also feel like once you get more experience, you become a little more objective and a little more detached from your material.
Hmm.
Um, can you talk a little bit about that and what that experience has been like for you?
Yeah, and I've actually heard from some much wiser older comedians to like at some point you do have to let some material go. And it does become, I mean, you know your set backwards and forwards, and you should, because you should be able to adjust to the crowd. And if somebody yells something out that can't, you have to be careful that doesn't throw you off. Like, you really need to know your material well and
Yeah.
your set. And um but it can have an adverse effect where you're up there just reciting lines and going through the motions, and some of that takes some joy out of the actual performance too, because you're like, I could do this in my sleep. Like, I
Yeah.
know exactly what my facial expression is, or the way my hand moves, or you work all of that um into your set. But it can come to a point where it just feels like you're regurgitating the same material. And
Totally.
so I think that there is an element of, keeping it fresh, like putting more material in, maybe even reworking bits that already work, doing it from a different perspective, or ultimately being like, I think that I'm going to take this out for a while. Um, and even too, I think that there's some jokes that in my mind they're still really funny, or like I have a bit about CrossFit, and I love doing that bit, but it doesn't work as well maybe as it used to, or as much as I thought. And part of it is because CrossFit it's not as, I think, frustrating to people as it used to. Like, it's a much more common thing now,
Yeah,
whereas when
yeah.
it first started, people are like, what is it? It's like a cult. Like, people had like their jokes about CrossFit. And so it doesn't land maybe as much anymore, because it's not as funny. And so
Yeah.
there came a point I was like, well, I guess I'll stop doing my CrossFit jokes, because it wasn't
Yeah.
landing in the same way that I'd wanted it to. And I might still bring it back at some point. But just like being able to say, okay, like this bit maybe isn't working anymore, or it worked for a period, especially like political humor and stuff. Like, there are seasons where certain jokes work really well,
Yeah.
um, and then maybe they don't work as much. And so you could either rewrite them and do them a little bit differently, or be willing to toss them and be like,
Yeah.
okay, like I'll keep that, I'll keep it, but I won't necessarily do it on stage. And maybe at some point I'll come back to it if it's relevant again.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, and I also what you just said a minute ago, like playing to your crowd, that kind of triggered something for me.
mm-hmm,
Like, I feel like, I mean, every audience or every time you go into a performance, you have to know that every
mm-hmm,
audience is going to be super diverse,
yeah.
and I wonder, how do you actually read an audience, right? Like, how do
Oh,
you
yeah.
know, like, when a joke is going to work and when it doesn't? Or, at some point, you have to know how to read your audience.
You do. And I will say that this is not an area that I'm probably the most experienced in, or maybe not that, but maybe I have a hard time with that still. And I think most of the shows that I do are in clubs, or yeah, places where it's going to be more, I don't know if I'd say more diverse, but maybe a little more diverse, but also it tends to be a younger crowd. And
Yeah.
that could be anywhere from 20s to 40s or 50s, but it's kind of within that range. And then I did a couple shows at wineries not too long ago, and that was not the same crowd. And so
Yeah.
immediately I walked in, I was like, oh, well, we'll see how this goes. And so the shows were great. Like, they ended up being fine, but immediately I knew there's I just don't know if my material is going to relate in the same way. And luckily it did, and so that was fine. But you can kind of tell by looking at an audience how you think it might go, and you might be right, you might be wrong. But that's still something I'm trying to kind of learn,
Yeah.
um, because I can do some adjustments to my material, but I'm not such an experienced comic, and I don't have as much material to be able to do that many adjustments. Whereas someone who's been doing it, like Tony, for example, who's been doing it for years and
Yeah.
has just an arsenal of jokes to pull from, like, for him, he's going to be able to walk into a room like that and change up his set and change it up in his mind
Yeah.
how he thinks it's going to go based on the crowd.
Yeah.
I can maybe do that to an extent. but not in the same way that he can. And so even if I might kind of think like, oh, this may not be as relatable, in my case, that may not actually affect my set a whole lot. It might affect it a little bit, but because I don't have the same amount of material to be able to change up.
Yeah.
So I don't know if that really.
Yeah, no, I totally get that because I also in life like reading people is challenging, and it's one of those things that you get better with time and experience, and I feel like we're all in this process of getting better and different aspects of there's so many different aspects of comedy and like stand up specifically because number one, you're up there by yourself. Two, you have to know your material. Three, you have to deliver it in a way that's going to make people laugh. Four, there's the audience to consider, right? Like you have absolutely no idea what kind of mood they're going to be in. If that mood is, if it's a dark energy that's in there or if it's lighthearted already, like, and also, if you're in a lineup of comics and a comic goes up before you that might have like completely diminished the room in some way, like you have to be able to pick that back up. So there's so many different aspects of comedy, stand-up specifically, that I think you just have to be aware of, and that comes with experience, and that comes with time being on stage. And it's terrifying.
Yeah, and you're really thinking about,
oh my God,
6 different things. You're thinking about your next joke. You're thinking about the guy on the right that has his arms folded and is just watching you and not laughing. And you're thinking about, am I in the light? When's my light? When. I mean, there's all these things that are going on in your head as you're doing comedy, which it's funny because I've talked about this with friends before that don't do comedy, and we've had this conversation. They're like, yeah, just it looks. Anytime I watch it, it looks easy. Not like they think, oh, I could go do it, but in their mind, they're like, when I watch it, it's amazing how comedians make it look easy because they know there's so much going on. I'm like, oh yeah, you're actually less thinking about your jokes sometimes than you are thinking about all of the other things that are going on. Yeah. And I do a lot of hosting, and so I get my time up kind of at the top of the show, and then I jump in between comedians and I introduce whatever, which is really fun, and it's super interesting because it has made me much more aware of the audience and what is happening in the audience. And so after I do my set and the next comedian goes up, that's what I'm doing. So I'm watching the audience, I'm watching them, I'm kind of listening to their material and kind of trying to analyze. And yeah, there's been shows that I've hosted where a comedian has just bombed, just terribly, like no laughs on the show, and then you're like, oh gosh, like I have to go back up and try to like keep people energized and be like, hey, give it up to that person and let's bring up the next one. And so you're like trying to kind of manage kind of the anxiety of watching a comedian bomb too. I think that to me that's almost more stressful than bombing myself, is watching someone else bomb, because I'm like, oh, I have no control, like this is so uncomfortable and I don't know what to do. And so then having to go back up and kind of try to get that energy back up and get people excited again for the next person, and that's all stuff that I'm still working on getting better at doing. But it's tough.
Oh my gosh. I feel like, people, when you're watching it on TV or whatever, you really don't get that dynamic feeling as when you're on stage and doing it. Like, I mean, I can only speak from like one experience, but, but it is such a dynamic experience that you really, your mind has to be kind of centered and so present to what's happening. I'm really curious to know like how that presence has translated into your personal life, or what that's been like for you, or what stand-up has done for you in your relationships, or how you approach the world.
Yeah. Oh man. I think that I think for one thing, it's one thing I will say that it is hard to, I think, kind of sometimes separate yourself from comedy. Like there's the, and as much as I can, I want to be myself on stage. When I go on stage, I want to talk about stuff the same way I would if I was sitting in your living room. Like, and that's often where my bits have come from, is like I was talking about something and we were ranting and joking and it turned into this whole thing, and I'm like, that's fun. Like, I should write some of that down because that's funny, or that idea is funny. And so I want to be someone who's on stage that, you know, my friends will watch me and they'll be like, oh, that's Grace. Like, that's exactly who we know her to be. But that said, there's still the kind of the separation of, you know, doing comedy, and there's still me. Like, there's still just kind of my own life and, you know, working through my own stuff. And so, you know, being able to, I think, like I said earlier, kind of be real about my own experience and maybe who I really am. Because I've joked for a long time about fake it till you make it. Because I feel like that's kind of been my story and funny. Like, you know, I've been put into jobs where I was like, I don't really know what I was doing, but, you know, if they think I know what I'm doing, then, you know, I'll figure it out. And I did. And kind of same thing with comedy. It's like, you get up there with enough confidence. If people look at you and you look like you know what you're doing, that immediately will ease them up a bit. Like, if a comedian gets on stage and they look really nervous, the crowd will feel that and will feel nervous. So I joke about that, but there is a little bit of truth, I think, to fake it till you. If you get up there with confidence and you tell your jokes, you know, with enough pizzazz or whatever, that will win them over to an extent. The jokes still obviously have to be funny, but the presentation of them is super important. So it's just like anything, you're kind of playing a character. And so just like anything else, you do have to go up there and be something, whether it's, if you've had a terrible day and you don't feel like being anything other than, you know, a binge watcher of Netflix, you still have to go out there and be something. And so there is that element of, you know, I think fake it till you make it. But there is also the element, like I said earlier, of you really have to be, I think, honest with yourself and honest with who you are and honest with your own experience and, you know, find the funny in that. And so I think now, like, as I've started doing this, I do have to separate myself to a degree, because there are nights that I walk off stage and I think, I'm done. I don't know why I'm doing this. I don't know why anybody thought that I should do this. This was a terrible idea. I'm not good. I'm never going to be, you know, whatever. Everybody has those moments of self-doubt. And then you have another night where you go on stage and you kill, and you're like, this is the best feeling. I can't believe I haven't been doing this for the last 20 years. Like, what was I doing?
I want to do this forever.
I want to do this forever and every night. Like, put me on all the shows. And so it's like the emotional roller coaster of it. It's up and down. It's up and down. And so because of that, there really has been an element of like, I can't live in that emotional roller coaster. There's enough of that in normal life.
Yeah.
I don't want to add onto that in the midst of doing something that I love. And so I've really had to try to, like, as I've kind of gotten more into, because I've only been doing stand-up for 2 years. So it's not like I've got years of experience that I'm speaking from and being like, oh, you know, when you're at my level, you figure these things out. That's for sure not true. But as I have gotten further into it and realized that performing comedy is way more than just the material.
Yeah.
Like we were saying, you're thinking about a zillion things and there's this emotional roller coaster. You do have to kind of like separate yourself from the comedy to a degree.
Yeah.
But by the same token, like, my friends will joke with me now. They'll be like, you're writing comedy in your head right now, aren't you? Or like, are you writing a bit about this? And which normally I'm not, but there are certain situations that's completely what I'm doing. I'm thinking like, this is ridiculous, or this is hilarious, or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And so it does kind of transform maybe the way that I think about things, or see things, or I think, oh, this could be funny, or I could write something about this. And but I do have to separate it, because I still have to be me, and I still have to take care of, you know, my life and my people and
Totally.
all of that. And so, like you said, like, kind of being in the present moment, like when I'm on stage, I'm a comedian and I'm doing those jokes and I'm, you know, performing, and whether it goes well or it goes terribly, when I leave, as much as I can, I have to leave it behind, and I have to then be present and, okay, now I have to go home and, you know, do my chores and, you know, shop or whatever it is that I'm doing.
Yeah.
And so, yeah, kind of being present, like you said, and it's tough.
I
it's
hear
tough,
you.
but Yeah.
I hear you. Well, I think we're coming up to the top of our time together.
Okay.
If there are 3 pieces of wisdom that you would like to share with our audience, especially women who are, thinking about pursuing comedy as a career, what would you share with them?
I think well, I think like I was just saying, like figuring out how to separate yourself, like who you are on stage as a comedian, that doesn't define you. That's not the whole of who you are. So if you are doing really well, like be excited, like own it, enjoy it. Don't like, but still like take feedback. Don't take that as okay, like I've made it.
Yeah.
But if you're doing terribly, also take feedback and don't quit. Like it's not like it doesn't define you. If you are not a good, if you feel like I'm not a good comedian, I'm not getting this, that doesn't define like who you are as a person. So be a comic in your own right, but also be yourself and authentic to yourself as much as you can. So I think that, and then I would say the second thing is take feedback. Like I said, if you're doing well, take feedback. If you're not doing well, take feedback, and just never be afraid to let somebody tell you where you can improve.
Yeah.
And then the third thing, write. Just write a ton. I think that any comedian would say that that's the hardest part of comedy is setting aside time to write, writing with people if you can do that. But just really, I think carving out space to, and even if you don't necessarily have anything, like maybe, I don't know, go online and look for a couple prompts, or look for, one of the prompts that I learned was, looking for like obscure news articles in like teeny towns around the country that nobody's heard of, because they're usually hilarious in and of themselves. But you can take that and you can, write a bit about that, or find some sort of prompt just to get you writing, and carve out, I don't know, as much time as you can and dedicate it to writing. Because if you write, a couple pages and then you wind up with a couple jokes out of it, like that's a pretty good percentage. You're like, oh, sweet, I just added 2 minutes of material or 5 minutes of material to my time.
Yeah.
So that's important, writing.
Well, cool. So, thank you so much.
Thanks
for
so much
coming,
for having
Grace.
me. This is great.
I had so much fun with you, and you are such an inspiration to me.
Thank you.
So thank you for joining us, and everybody, please follow Grace.
Yes.
Where can they find you?
So gracekleincomedy.com. And Klein, I feel like I have to always explain. Klein is spelled Klein, not Kline. So Klein. Grace Klein Comedy, and then I'm on Twitter, Instagram. It's Grace_E_Klein for both of those, and then Grace Klein Comedy on Facebook as well.
Great.
So I'm on all of the things. So
me too. Cool. We are too. So find us on all of the things, all of the platforms, and I'll leave all of the information in the show notes as well. So thank you guys for joining us. We're at here. Oh my God, I can't even speak right now. We're at here right now. We're here at sheshedcomedy.com and She Shed Comedy Podcast. Thanks for listening, and we'll talk to you and see you, hopefully engage with you soon. Take care. Love ya. Bye.
Thank you.